I'm Gleaves Whitney, Director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies these past 17 years now, and tonight the co-host with Michael DeWilde, who is the Director of the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative here at Grand Valley and a partner for this evening's event. I hope this evening's event challenges you. I founded the Hauenstein Center's Common Ground Initiative in 2012 with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We predicate our work on the belief that what unites us as human beings and as American citizens is far more important than what separates us as, say, Republicans or Democrats or liberals and conservatives. America is our home, and we've got to figure out how, in good faith, we can listen to each other, learn from each other, debate with each other, disagree with each other without being disagreeable, as Gerald Ford would say, and renew our commitment to this beautiful thing, this American experiment in ordered liberty. Tonight's event is the Hauenstein Center's 9th Progressive Conservative Summit, and I think it's needed more than ever. On my staff, Jacob Begard tracks the Pew research that reveals in some detail, sadly, how many people there are out there who don't even care to understand or know what people who don't think the way they do think. Well, how's that supposed to work? So if I don't talk to you and you don't talk to me, how are we going to be able to solve the problems that we face together, you and I? Now, I know we all have our non-negotiables. We think that our side is right, and that's fine. But we cannot regard ourselves as enemies who occupy the same territory. We stand our ground where we must, and we seek common ground where we can. Now, we heard a lot in the last 4 months about having a republic if we can keep it. Now, we cannot blame the president, we cannot blame Congress or one party or the other for the lack of constructive engagement when we have the opportunity to talk to people who have a different view from our own. I mean, this is a democracy. This is what we're supposed to do. None of the founders thought that everybody would agree and just always get along. So if you think things are messed up, go to work. Do what you can to bridge the partisan divide, and I would suggest you do it. Start by going out to the reception afterwards, where you're going to have a lot of cookies, and it's amazing how a Ralph Hauenstein chocolate chip cookie can bring people together. In addition to Ralph, I think of our good friend Bob Quinn at the University of Michigan, who taught our Cook Leadership Academy fellows to build the bridges that span our differences. Maybe our priority here in Michigan should be fix the damn bridges, the bridges back to our original social compact and civic friendship. I'd now like to invite Michael DeWilde, philosophy professor and director of the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative, up. He will be moderating tonight's debate. Michael, please welcome him.
Thank you. I'll add my hellos to Gleaves as well. Look forward to learning a great deal this evening. Let me introduce the panelists to you. My job is relatively simple. I'm going to read questions. They're going to respond to those. As you can see, I'm a little bit behind and to their right. They've got 2 minutes initially to respond to the questions that are on the table. We don't, unlike the Democrats, have a really fancy lighting system up in front. So around 2 minutes, I'll gently intervene, and around 2.5 minutes, I'll less gently intervene. So, all right. All the way to my far left is Dr. Kelly Parker. He is professor of philosophy and director of the environmental studies program here at Grand Valley. Sitting with him is John Kinch. Dr. Kinch is the executive director of Michigan Energy Options. Jan O'Connell from the Sierra Club was slated to be here but cannot. To my near left, then, we have Jason Hayes, who's director of the environmental policy program at the Mackinac Center. Kevon Martis, senior policy analyst of the Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition, and Lisa Linowes, founder of windaction.org. I let them know that I would just offer a very brief summary overview of the Green New Deal. The particular Green New Deal that at least we're starting with is the House proposal that was offered up by Cortez and Markey last year. The Green New Deal is a congressional resolution that lays out a grand plan for tackling climate change. Introduced by Representative Alexandria Cortez of New York and Senator Markey of Massachusetts, both Democrats, the proposal calls on the federal government to wean the United States from fossil fuels and curb planet-warming greenhouse gas emissions across the economy. It also aims to guarantee new high-paying jobs in clean energy industries. The resolution is, as of now, non-binding, so even if Congress took it up and approved it, nothing in the program right now in the proposal would actually become law. However, it is our intent, since it's an election year, to do what we can to inform the voting public on various issues before us. And so we thought the Green New Deal would be a good place to start, given the growing and sustained interest in climate change and policy responses to it. When we invited everybody this evening, we did intend to say we're not really looking forward primarily to a debate about the climate change science itself, but rather policy responses to it, which is why we framed it as a Green New Deal debate. All right. The technical aspects of this, I'll ask the question, and they'll have signs. They have signs in front of them, thumbs up or thumbs down, whether they agree or disagree. I'll start with the people who disagree. They'll have 2 minutes to begin a response. We'll go back and forth. If everybody agrees with everything all the time, then we'll just go have those Hauenstein cookies now. So. All right. We've got 60 minutes for the debate. There's a 20-minute Q&A that follows, so hopefully everybody, including all of you, will have a chance to have your say. First one, the Green New Deal calls for the removal and replacement of carbon-based fuels with non-carbon-based ones. This is important, says the proposal, because the first step in stemming the damage of climate change is slowing and eventually halting the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Without such action, anything else is negligible. And what we do is ask you at this point, and I can reread it if you like, would you agree with that or disagree with that statement that halting the release of greenhouse gas emissions is the most crucial first step? Okay. What a shock. Okay. So, Mr. Hayes, can I ask you to begin in 2 minutes, please?
Certainly. Thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you for the invite. My response to this one came in the terms of that this notion of the, in quotes, damage of climate change is left undefined in this question. So I said that's a serious issue because the appropriate policy response can't be determined without a clear understanding of what the impacts of climate change will be. So one example, a recent publication in the journal Nature talked about the idea that there's scenarios that are run, modeling scenarios that discuss the different potential impacts of climate change. And one of those scenarios is kind of the worst case scenario. It's called RCP 8.5. That was described in the paper as increasingly implausible because essentially what it expects is that we would have to increase our use of coal around the planet by 500%, that mitigation measures, things like the Green New Deal or renewable portfolio standards and that sort of thing that are being brought into play across the states and then across the rest of the planet, all of those would have to stop, and we would have to, again, up our use of coal by 500%. So the notion that that scenario, which is what situations like the Green New Deal and the notion that we have only 12 years left, that is based, or that RCP 8.5 is what those predictions are based on. And even published science in journals like Nature is saying that that's increasingly implausible. So if we look at the next one down, RCP 6.0, they're saying, again in that paper, that we would have a 3-degree increase in global temperatures, average global temperatures. Okay, well, there are other scientists who have published papers like Judith Curry, who's the president of the Climate Forecast Applications Network and a former professor and chair of the School of Earth and Atmosphere Sciences at Georgia Institute of Technology. She
Mr.
published.
Hayes.
I'm done. Okay. Very quickly, she published a paper that said models overachieve or overestimate by 45% the heating that we could expect. If that happens, then we would be at 1.65. 3 degrees multiplied by 45 is 1.65, which is almost at the 1.5 degrees centigrade that the IPCC is saying we need to stop at. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. Dr. Parker or Mr. Kinch?
Some of the numbers there don't quite align with what I've seen. I'm going to go back to the, first of all, in relation to the idea of 8.5, that is indeed the extreme high end of what's even, physically conceivable. I don't think anybody is saying that is what we're in for. The concern, as the IPCC report from 2018 said, is initially at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of change globally, which is very plausible. In fact, my estimation is that 1.5, that's where you get the 2030 deadline, that we need to reduce emissions by 50% by the year 2030 in order to keep us at 1.5 degrees. That's an ambitious goal. We've already lost 2 years to achieve that from when this was predicted. I honestly, myself, think we need to start thinking in terms of 2 or 3 degrees over the next X number of years. It's just not the case that we don't know what the effects will be. I don't know what is going to happen to me on Tuesday of next week. There's always unpredictability, especially about the future, right? We do know, however, what the generic effects will be, and in some specific cases, as with cities like Miami or or New Orleans are like, we know that flooding will continue to be an increasing problem. Globally, the models of levels of sea level rise, the predictions of more frequent, more intense hurricanes and other similar powerful storms, the likelihood of increased heat waves, especially over land areas, right? If you get global warming, that's the global average. If you go up a couple of degrees globally, you're going up more degrees locally over the land. We have a pretty good idea of what those effects will be at the most likely temperature projections, which are anywhere between 1.5 degrees at this point, pretty unlikely, we'll keep it to that. And depending on who you look at, 4.5 or 6 degrees, also increasingly less likely the further you go out. Somewhere in the middle there is really pretty bad over the long term.
Thank you. Shall we throw it back to this side?
Well, good evening. I want to clarify my no vote, and that's because the premise of this question invokes the Green New Deal, which my understanding is largely a coercive rollout of wind and solar, primarily coupled with storage, on a very quick time frame. And that's my fundamental objection to this. If I were to state to you tonight that the idea that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels in the United States, China, India, or the world as a whole is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy, you might wish to accuse me of intemperate speech. But those, of course, are not my words. Those are the words of Dr. James Hansen, arguably the world's leading climate scientist. And if I were to say it was kind of crushing to discover that the things I believed in weren't real, and then to discover that the solar panels and wind turbines were not going to save the planet, you likely would not conclude that I was quoting Michael Moore's producer Jeff Gibbs as he discusses his new documentary exposing the failures of non-hydro renewable energy. And if I were to say the reason renewables can't power modern civilization is because they were never meant to, one interesting question is why anybody ever thought they could, you would be excused if you thought I was quoting some coal company executive rather than the Time magazine hero of the environment, Michael Schellenberger. You see, all these progressive folks are deeply concerned about CO2 emissions and climate change. And they all have looked under the hood of renewable energy forcing schemes like the Green New Deal and discovered not only do these plans not lead to the rapid decarbonization Hansen tells us we need, these schemes' primary benefactors are the very fossil fuel entities they were meant to penalize. I believe it's my position and my colleagues on this side that if we are serious about reducing CO2 emissions, we must abandon renewable energy forcing policies which have yielded only relatively minor emissions reductions, but at a very high price per ton avoided. And instead, we should set forth an emissions reduction timeline and let the market pick the cheapest and most efficient means of reaching those targets by considering each technology's virtues and vices rather than its political favor.
Thank you. Mr. Kinch?
Yeah, and thank you for having me, Michael and everyone. I run a renewable energy nonprofit, clean energy nonprofit company. I'm also academically trained as an environmental historian. I don't often get to pull out that second card very often. So I just wanted to briefly comment about what has been, our energy system for the last 100 or so years. And it has been a system in which we have extracted coal primarily from the ground. We've burned it in 20th century combustion engines, and we have baseload plants located around the country with long transmission lines to power our economies. It's worked really well for 100 years. What we didn't realize is there were externalities to that. There were other things that were happening, pollution, mercury, NOx and SOx, and as well as carbon dioxide. And so the industry, the utility industry is changing. It isn't staying with coal. It's not staying with coal for a couple reasons. One, those plants are not economical to run anymore. But two, they recognize that CO2 is a problem. Now, they're transitioning to natural gas combined cycle plants a lot. Natural gas has a 60% less of a carbon footprint than coal does. But these companies are also moving towards renewables because they recognize, again, that is a dependable source of power if it's used on a grid that works. And one of the things we need to work on, and we'll probably talk about a little later tonight, is our grid. But nonetheless, renewables are viable. They have about 10-15% of our mix right now in Michigan. They have larger mixes around the country. It just depends kind of where you are. But the fact is that the fossil fuel industry that we have known for most of our lives, at least on the coal side of things, is going to go away. And it's going away because of regulations, but it's also going away simply because economic drivers.
Ms. Linowes, do you want
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So my question, and my point about the carbon-based fuels and whether we could do it without them, I think it's very difficult for most people to understand what it means to live in a world without carbon fuels. And also to see a replacement with largely wind and solar, which for the last decade at least have been the prominent sources of non-emitting other than nuclear power. And what I would like to draw your attention to is the real world effects of going to a non-carbon emitting environment using wind. Right now, wind, because that has been the largest source of generation in this country that's renewable. From the period from 2006 to 2018, we saw a 9-fold increase in the amount of wind installed in this country. We went from 11,000 roughly megawatts to almost 100,000 megawatts. What that means in terms of consumption is nationwide, you're consuming 7.2% of the electricity you consume, or this country consumes, comes from wind energy. 7.2%, okay? That's with nearly 100,000 megawatts installed. In that same period, we've had vast swaths of sensitive wildlife areas in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, you name the state other than in the southeast, that has been absolutely transformed into a forest of wind turbines. When you think about that and you listen to wind energy developers, they'll tell you, we're mitigating for the effects. Well, in fact, they are not mitigating for the effects. We have bats that are being wiped out of the sky. We have birds that are wiped out, whether you want to believe it or not. It is happening. There are 45 species of bats in the North American area. 14 of them now are showing significant decline. that were at one time most populated. Part of that's white nose. Part of that, a big part of that, especially in the western part of the country, is wind turbines. On ridge lines, developers literally blast mountaintops. You want to talk about coal mining, mountaintop mining? Wind turbines. We're building vast roadways and putting on ridge lines. We're building them in our plains. We're putting turbines up. And where there isn't a turbine, you have a transmission system going through. Now, bear in mind, we're only at 100,000 megawatts. We're only at 7.2%. What do you think 100% looks like? We're up to 1.4 million megawatts of turbines. We're not talking about tens of millions of acres as we are today, covered with wind turbines. We're talking about hundreds of millions of acres covered in wind turbines. When you hear an environmentalist tell you we have to go to renewables in order to save the wildlife because climate change is going to be more devastating to the wildlife than renewables, or than anything, right? When you wipe out habitat that was never touched before, or largely untouched by mankind, and you put in wind turbines, you are damaging the wildlife. And here's the issue.
I'm sorry, we're at time. So
I'll
an
get
awful lot
through.
of points already out in the air, just in this first first response to the first question. Anything in 1 minute, if you can, that you want to respond to in terms of what you heard from anything either side has said?
I might just offer one comment to the question about why the utilities are transitioning to wind and solar. In the state of Michigan, we have regulated utilities, and so we've often heard it said that fossil fuel companies oppose wind and solar because they don't like the competition. But when you're a regulated utility like Consumers Energy or Detroit Edison, I think Senator Seitz in Ohio summed it up neatly when he said, our regulated utilities would produce electricity by paying Boy Scouts to rub sticks together to make fire, as long as they could pass on their 10.7% regulated rate of return on that activity back to the ratepayers. So it is economical for them, but not with respect to the value and the price of the energy they produce. They literally don't care what form they use to produce that electricity as long as those profits are guaranteed.
Let me just make 3 points in response to 3 distinct things. We are indeed in the middle of a mass extinction planet-wide. That's not because of wind turbines. That's because of other changes and loss to habitat. The wind turbines are not the cause of the vast majority of species extinction, and I'm glad to hear you're concerned about it. So there's that point. Second point, we are, if you look at the scope of proposed measures, which are very roughly pointed to, there's no specifics, there's no mandate for wind, for example, in the Green New Deal. It includes things like increasing efficiency of our buildings, which would be an enormous savings of energy and therefore savings of emissions. It involves very common sense and I think popular steps like that, improving our infrastructure, improving efficiency across the board. And I don't recall what my third point was, so we'll go with 2.
Can I just jump on that real quick, Michael?
1 minute, sure.
So one of the ways to think about the new energy paradigm is not to simply think about generation, whether it's coming from a coal plant or wind turbines or solar panels, but to think also about how you consume energy. And certainly energy efficiency is a great thing to be doing to our buildings. It has a 4-to-1 return on your investment. So for every dollar you spend on energy efficiency, you're getting $4 back in energy savings. Another way to think about the new sort of paradigm is this idea of changing our attitudes of ourselves as consumers, where I'm just taking something from a utility, and more of the line of a prosumer, which in other words means some of you might be producing on site. You might have solar panels on your roof of your building. You might have a Tesla storage battery at your office that you're using on certain days. There could be any number of things you can be doing to actually contribute to the production, so to speak, of energy, the translation of energy among wires in other buildings like that. So it's a much more complex model than what I think where most of us are used to thinking about. But what that does, though, is suggests is that it isn't just going to be about ramping up generation, whether it's wind farms, solar farms, whatever. It's also going to be about using energy more wisely.
In 1 minute, please, and then we'll move on to the
Just
next
want
question.
to comment very quickly. The question was specifically removal and replacement of carbon-based fuels. So we're not I didn't think we were talking about other aspects of the Green New Deal. But I did want to make a point. The United States right now consumes 4 billion megawatt hours of generation. I know that's a big number, it doesn't mean anything, but that's what it takes to run our economy, 4 billion. To put that in perspective, most of us consume less than 1 megawatt hour in a month. 4 billion for the country in a year, most of us consume 1 billion, less than 1 in a month. So the point being, yeah, we could do our everyday little things, put solar panels on our roofs and be energy efficient and everything else. That's not going to make a dent in 4 billion megawatt hours. It's going to take a much bigger transformation than that.
That's actually a great segue to the next question, which is this, or statement to which they can agree or disagree. The Green New Deal, however noble its motives might be in addressing climate change, will simply cost too much and be ruinous for the economy. It's an unrealistic approach to a very real problem for which there are better solutions. Okay.
That's called cognitive dissonance.
It's unrealistic.
I'm sorry.
No.
Michael, I told you this was too complicated.
It's a-
I got going.
It's a new system we're piloting this evening. How's it going?
Isn't there an app for this?
Actually, because he has not been back in the conversation for a while, let's let Mr. Hayes begin in response. For 2 minutes, please.
Okay, discussing the costs and the impacts, building on the answer that I gave previously, the next question that has to be answered, if we're trying to understand the impacts of the science and what does that actually mean, then the next question is, what are the impacts on the economics? What would be the costs of embracing a Green New Deal style of energy policy? And Lisa already very capably discussed the environmental impacts, the habitat losses that would occur, where solar and wind are both very diffuse energy resources. So if you compare, for example, a piece of a pellet of nuclear fuel about the size of a pencil eraser can power your home for about a month. Compare that to, one of the most recent suggestions, proposals in the state of Michigan for new solar will essentially pave over, develop 10 square miles of farmland that's down in the area where Kevin lives in Linowes County. So you're collecting extremely diffuse resources to try to provide power compared to other options like nuclear, which don't have the emissions problems that fossil fuels or coal or that have. So there's that aspect. The mining impacts, there's a fellow named Mark Mills who works at the Manhattan Institute who wrote a paper. It was talking about the magical thinking that's inherent in the Green New Deal. He was discussing just the batteries, because we've heard that if you had a Tesla wall, then you could deal with, you could begin to provide some of these things that utilities have in the past. A single electric car battery weighs about 1,000 pounds. Fabricating, Mills says, fabricating one requires digging up, moving, and processing more than 500,000 pounds of raw materials somewhere on the planet. His alternative that he suggests is use gasoline and extract 1/10 the tonnage required to deliver the same number of vehicle miles over the battery's seven-year life. He also goes on to say one wind turbine requires 900 tons of steel, 2,500 tons of concrete, 45 tons of unrecyclable plastics. There was a Bloomberg article that just came out on February 5th, I think it was, that showed the wind turbine blades being buried in landfills in Wyoming because they can't recycle them right now. So they basically do with them the same thing that people were concerned about the coal plants, just dumping, landfilling coal ash. We're now doing the same thing with wind turbines. Coming up very soon, I've received emails from both DTE and Consumers Energy where they said they have no plan currently for disposing of the solar panels that they are going to build. Consumers Energy plans in its latest plan to build 6.35 gigawatts of solar in the state of Michigan. To give you a basic idea of what that looks like, the Palisades nuclear plant that they're planning to close is 800 megawatts.
Mr. I'm sure it's annoying to hear my voice, but
That's quite all right. I
sorry.
could do this all night. I just keep
yeah.
talking and talking, so thank
can
you
see
for
that.
help.
I could see it. In your response, whoever wants to pick this up, does anybody want to offer a point of clarification about what the Green New Deal says in terms of renewables? Because so far, at least to my ear, it sounds like it's being set up as largely a question of which renewables or a contest between wind and solar versus carbon or nuclear. And is that, for the audience's sake in mind, is that a fair representation of what the Green New Deal is saying?
I'll comment on that. So the Green New Deal does not cite specific fuels. It does talk about carbon neutral or achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And goes on to say meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, zero emission energy sources. But the point being, and if I could add to that, why there seems to be a focus on wind and solar here is because for the last decade plus, wind and solar have been the only utility scale resources of renewables that have been put in place. And if we're talking 10 years, they're probably going to be the dominant resource over the next 10 years.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Gentlemen?
Were you going to say something?
No.
Well, can I go back to Jason's point about farmland and about that resource of ours here? Because like these guys, I'm a Michigan guy and a nature guy, and I have concerns about how our rural lands and how our natural lands are treated. On the solar side, at least, there's been a lot of work that we've been doing and others about this notion of co-locating solar with agricultural lands, and that there is pretty good research out there. It's preliminary, but they're starting to build a bit of a history of it, of being able to, for example, locate solar with pollinator plants and native grasses to help out the birds and the bees and the pollinators. We own a community solar park in East Lansing on a capped landfill. And there we have planted pollinator species ourselves in between those rows of solar panels with the idea that we can help the bees. Another farmland, there's ways of taking solar and perhaps putting it in land that's not the most prime land, and then ideally that would allow that land to go fallow for a while. So maybe 20 years from now, it's maybe organic and no longer full of pesticides and herbicides, fertilizers. Also, there's discussion about how solar actually, in our ex-urban environments, could be a deterrent to sprawl because you're locating solar there instead of having another strip mall that gets pushed further out from that city place. So I think there are ways to have solar in our rural lands as well as having those lands still be productive in some way, shape, or form. Additionally, marginal lands, brownfields. Michigan has a lot of brownfields. We did a study out of our Marquette office in the Upper Peninsula, taking a look at the potential for solar just on those legacy properties left behind by the mining industry and industrialism of the 20th century. We identified 40 or 50 sites that have utility infrastructure nearby, that have all the facilities you would need to kind of hook a solar array up to that system. 450 megawatts of potential solar in the Upper Peninsula. Now, that's not insignificant in terms of solar, and that's just a fraction of the marginal lands we have around Michigan. Like I said, our project in East Lansing's on a capped landfill. I don't know why we're not putting solar on capped landfills across the state.
One follow-up to that, John, and then I'll ask this side to come back and respond to that. And that is, Lisa made the point that, well, you could put all that together and you're still not anywhere close to what you need to run the economy. Would you concede that point, or you don't want to?
Well, I think what I'd say to that is that it's not one silver bullet anymore. It isn't base load power, large plants, facilities like we've had in the past. I mean, DT is trying to get the Michigan Public Service Commission to approve a 1,100 megawatt natural gas combined cycle plant. That's a big plant. And to be sure, a lot of the wind and the solar plants are not quite that size. But again, if you think about how you can site those smartly, how you can use roofs, how you can use parking lots, how you can use marginal lands, brownfields, and begin to put it together and combine that with smart systems in which you have systems talking to each other, work on issues around demand, work on issues around peak, doing those kinds of things, you begin to have a system that's going to function. And I just question the idea that we're going to need to just get there by generation alone. I think some of it is going to be about not using that kilowatt.
Thank you. Mr. Martis.
Well, I'm glad we get to talk about solar in rural areas, because it's my county that's being targeted for 10 square miles of solar development. Just the first project is 1,700 acres. It would involve 400,000 solar panels. They will weigh 24 million pounds. There is no disposal plan for those. And unfortunately, where they've sited them, Lenawee County is usually number 1, number 2 in corn and soybeans statewide. And because a transmission line upgrade came through the middle of our townships, that's become a hot spot for Samsung and ESA Solar out of Florida. They're there because of the transmission. What they didn't care about and don't care about is not only is this productive farm ground, it's considered some of the very best farm ground, not just in Michigan or my county, but in the Midwest. 300 bushel corn is routine on this ground. And so now we get this disconnect that first caught my attention when former Mayor Hartwell announced a 100%, I think, renewable energy plan for Grand Rapids. I would agree. I would be much more impressed if that plan was going to be satisfied from with your jurisdictional limits. Those plans are being satisfied in our communities, and it's not environmentally minded people who are showing up in our communities to develop these solar and wind projects. They're Fortune 500 companies who have nothing but a profit motive in mind. And they bully and cajole and manipulate our rural communities into accepting these projects. The truth is, if we really believe the Green New Deal is going to power our economy for the next 50 or 100 years with primarily wind and solar, why would, after 20 years, anybody ever tear a PV solar array out? They're not going to. And that's what we're facing. That 1,100 megawatt gas plant that's proposed by DTE will fit in less than 1 square mile. Every gas, coal, and nuclear plant in the state of Michigan would fit in 1 township. We've covered 25 townships with wind turbines to produce only a few percentage points of electricity. That's bad economics, that's bad energy policy, that's bad for the environment, and it's bad for the social fabric of the communities who are having their communities industrialized to satisfy the environmental-minded leanings of the urban elite.
Thank you. Response?
I thought they were the pro-business side. I guess I would just step in and say, you know, the terms of the debate were framed in terms of pro-business and pro-government. I think what we've just seen is that it is way more complicated than that. I think way back at the beginning of this question, there was something about how do we pay for it? Was that the focus?
It's going to be ruinous to the economy.
I know if I went to the wrong page. And
It's behind you if you need it.
okay, right. And I'd like to bring our attention back to that, which is, if you look at the proposals, the kinds of things that are being explored in the Green New Deal, it all looks new, and we all know new things are expensive. And so the price tag looks quite frightening, sticker shock, trillions. However, over the 10 years, the 20 years for implementation that we're talking about, what will we spend anyway? right? In terms of simply ordinary infrastructure upgrading and repair. Y'all live in Michigan. We have some work to do on our roads, our bridges. We're going to spend many billions on that. Something like the Green New Deal could say, well, let's think for a minute about how we're spending that. Are we simply rebuilding the infrastructure that was designed for our cities and our needs in the 1950s and 60s? I mean, who would renovate their kitchen to what it looked like in 1950, right? No, we renovate it for modern needs and modern uses and modern functionality. So a great deal of it's coming there. If we factor in also the already occurring costs of adjusting to the effects of climate change. I live on the lake shore. The city of Grand Haven just had to allocate a bunch of money to raise their roads 18 inches because they're flooded due to the high water levels in Lake Michigan. That's happening all over. That is only going to increase. When you start to add up the cost of the new stuff, it looks like the cost of repairing the old stuff. Green New Deal is a way to guide policy toward rebuilding in a way that suits us better. The particulars, yeah, I'm not a fan of taking productive farmland and turning it into solar power. I think people need to speak up against that and say there are better places to locate this. That doesn't mean solar is bad.
Yes, we've jumped ahead to common ground. So. Not bad. Question number 3. I was also, just occurred to me, I was asked to do a bit of a straw poll for the audience too, so the people on stage can get a sense of where some of you might be and who to avoid when Q&A comes up. So, just joking. So let me ask this, I'll again make the statement. I'm sorry.
I didn't get a chance to respond to that question. Could I just really quickly?
Sure, sorry, sure.
I'll just keep it really short. I just wanted to say that I agree that we have no idea what this is going to cost, the Green New Deal. Could be in the hundreds of billions, definitely could be in the trillions, but I just want to keep in mind that it's not going to be cheap to transition off fossil fuel, but when you retrofit millions of existing buildings so they're more energy efficient and construct an infrastructure to support the Green New Deal, but then we're also talking about assuring everyone a living wage and a job with a living wage, affordable housing, universal health care, job training, and to eliminate all of the social injustices that are perceived to exist today. That is all in the Green New Deal. We're talking about revamping this country in a way that we've never imagined, and I encourage everyone to read that resolution. It's way more than just green energy. Thank you.
Again, you've given me the perfect segue to the next statement, which is exactly on that. Critics have called the Green New Deal a, quote, laundry list of progressive ideas, close quote. But climate change is going to affect every part of all of our lives, though those who are poor will likely suffer more than those with means. Fighting climate change will require massive job retraining, universal health care, and living wages simply to ensure a just transition to an economy that will be altered by climate change. Agree or disagree? I can read it again if you like. Or it should be up there. Yes, I'm asking you.
Is this a struggle?
In other words, fighting climate change will require massive job retraining, universal health care, and living wages simply to ensure a just transition to an economy that will be altered by climate change. See where we are. If you agree, sorry, if you agree.
See, I'm not the only one confused, Michael.
Sorry. We're all confused. They didn't give you little thumbs when you came? Okay. All right. Okay, so let me put that to the panel, please.
Oh. Wait, they're red, so. All right. I just figured out how I don't have to think about this.
Are any of the rest of you getting the feeling we can dispense with those or not? Lisa, you started this conversation. Do you want to go ahead and pick up, and John will have you respond?
Real quick, I mean, I think in some ways, there's the premise that the Green New Deal is starting from a hard stop is mistaken. I mean, this stuff is already happening in our economy. There's something like 250,000 jobs in solar in the country right now. That's more than there are coal miners. There's $17 billion investment in the American economy last year from solar, I believe. It was something around that kind of a number. Michigan itself is doing pretty well. We've got 300 companies in the renewable energy business, everything from wind and solar to components and various other kinds of things like that. We have something like 5,400 jobs in the solar industry. And I'm glad this is going to take retraining of people. I'm glad we're going to be putting people to work in trade jobs that aren't necessarily jobs where you're in the service industry where you might be really struggling to make ends meet. The idea is that these are jobs that are going to take some skill, and they're going to be around for a while. Estimates, with solar and wind and some of these other technologies is that it's going to take, 10 years or so to build them out, and there's going to take a certain amount of operation and maintenance over the next 20 years to make sure that they continue to run. I think the fact that, that we have companies that have located here because we have good opportunities to have renewable energy is a positive. I think it's good that the auto companies are looking at EVs and retraining people to build EVs. I think that kind of economic activity, by and large, is a good thing for our state and it's a good thing for the American economy. I don't necessarily see it as costing too much. I instead just see that you're directing that financing towards something which is new. And I will say this, it's the financiers who are behind this. It's the money looking for a home that's making the difference. BlackRock, that investment bank, just said they're not going to be investing in anything that causes climate change. So there's going to be a lot of capital moving around looking for a home. And I think if you can attract that capital to the state or to your business, you ought to do it.
Lisa, sorry.
I'd like to respond to that very quickly. Here, the issue is, if the federal subsidies and the state subsidies were eliminated today, bang, gone, you won't see solar built and you won't see wind built. That is a fact. And we know that because the PTC to production tax credit, which is the prominent federal subsidy, was supposed to end at the end of last year, and it re-upped again. So we're not talking about an industry, either solar or wind, that's capable of generating enough electricity during the course of the year to make enough money for operations and maintenance and to earn a profit. So when we talk about who's the more business friendly here, we're fully, I think I could speak for both of all three of us, we're all supportive of businesses. We're not supportive of businesses that are investments made by the government. And we're not going to fund our way through subsidies or what have you to a more efficient source of wind or solar. There are limitations to what renewable energy can go. So, and I did have, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
It's been my experience that when a discussion about energy policy shifts to jobs, it's usually an example of misdirection, because we build generators because we need electricity that has virtues and vices that are appealing to the community. If we were trying to create devices that created the greatest number of jobs, and that would be the rationale for deploying them, maybe we would mandate that fat guys like me have to power their home by spending a lot of time on a treadmill generator. And at least I'm partially dispatchable. I'm available, at least according to my wife, occasionally when there's some heavy lifting to be done. But we need to understand a bigger picture question here. Because energy is an overhead cost for all human activity, be it steel manufacturing or automobiles or social justice or your local Head Start program or your church, the most desirable source of energy would require the fewest number of employees. In fact, the ideal one would require only one to turn the switch on and off. That's the goal we should be striving for. Now, finally, the opportunity cost is so my objection to the fact that the Green New Deal is going to be lavishly expensive, my objection to that is that it doesn't need to be. We know how much it would cost to replace every coal-fired power plant in the United States with nuclear power, and it's $1.25 trillion. The Green New Deal price tags I've seen have been 50 to 100 trillion. Take a look at the wind turbines we've built in the state of Michigan. We've incented and demanded about $4 to $5 billion worth of expenditure on wind turbines in the state of Michigan that function on average like about a 600 megawatt generator, half the size of the plant proposed by Detroit Edison. They're going to last 20 years. that same amount of money would have produced a 600 megawatt nuclear power plant that would last 60 to 80 years. Or for that same money, we could have already replaced most of the coal-fired power plants in our state with natural gas, which would have eliminated mercury emissions and fine particulate emissions, radically improving the health of the people in this state at a far lower cost and with a much longer lifespan. I'm not a particular proponent of any of those technologies, but we have to look at the opportunity cost of what's proposed. We know how to rapidly decarbonize the electrical grid in a nation. Sweden and France both did it in 12 years by deploying a large rollout of nuclear power. Nobody that's serious about halting climate change as a result of anthropogenic global warming would propose wind and solar. If we have 12 years, there is only one solution, and it's proven, and it's called nuclear energy.
Thank you.
Which, me or?
Well, let me throw it back over to the other side just for the moment.
Nuclear is a very popular option, and I am happy to talk about that as soon as somebody, and we've been working on this for 60 years.
You're going to say waste.
So you already know the problem. I'm done.
Well, there is an answer to that. We have a similar waste
If
problem.
you have an answer for that, please put it into effect, because
Oh.
nobody's done it yet.
Oh, absolutely, but you have a waste problem as well. Solar produces 300 times the waste of nuclear power,
Which is
and
not
every wind
radioactive.
turbine spinning in the state of Michigan produces 2 to 4 tons of unrecyclable fossil fuel waste in the form of the rotor blades. So what are we going to do with that waste? Secondly, since it doesn't replace a gas or coal-fired nuclear power plant, all that waste has to persist. So there is a waste issue. Finally, all the nuclear waste in the United States would fit on just one football field. All of it. And it can be reprocessed and developed through other technology.
Well, let me stay with the panel. There's a Q&A coming up. So, response, please.
Awesome. Put you in charge of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. You can put this into effect tomorrow, and I'll be very impressed about nuclear power. We've solved the waste problem, apparently. How come nobody outside this room knew it, right? I'm skeptical. There's also a problem with nuclear at the other end of the process, which is the mining, which needn't have such an atrocious history of pollution, but it in fact has had, and unless we can have some guarantees that that is conducted in a much more responsible manner, it's very hard to see the benefit. There's waste, and then there's radioactive waste too, and I think that's a very important distinction.
All I would say is if you take nuclear off the table, then you're not serious about combating climate change. It's that simple. You have to pick one or the other. There are virtues and vices to all of these, but that much is clear. Nothing is going to be dispatched and deployed fast enough to halt this in 10 to 12 years. We've already spent 10 years with wind and solar to have only trivial reductions in emissions. So that's the choice. I didn't create the science. That's the choice we have.
And also, the reality is, if mining is a problem, you've got an even bigger problem with the steel, the copper, the rare earth minerals, all of those sorts of things that you need to build wind and solar. You actually will have a larger problem, again, looking at the work of people like Mark Mills from the Manhattan Institute. You literally have to up the mining that we're doing by orders of magnitude to be able to supply the steel and that sort of thing that you need for the wind and the solar. Additionally, then you add in the problem that a lot of the cobalt and lithium that we get that supplies, that we use to build our batteries and our renewable energy sources comes from places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they employ 9-year-old kids to get the lithium out of the ground that we want. A lot of these issues that we're dealing with are based in this idea that if you're you shouldn't be outsourcing your pollution. You should be recognizing that there are real environmental costs to every energy source. So yes, coal has issues with particulate matter, with CO2, with other emissions. Natural gas has CO2 that you have to deal with, fugitive methane emissions coming from pipelines. But wind and solar have the habitat issues, the wildlife issues, the now mining issues, the disposal issues. All of those things exist for wind and solar, and we're only beginning to start to see them because right now in Michigan, Solar provides about 0.4 to 0.6%, so 0.4% of our electricity. Wind provides about 4 to 7 in that nature. So we're going to have to shut down approximately 90 to 95% of the energy generation sources that we use right now today to provide our electricity, to power our businesses, to be able to have, like, so I can sit here with a bright light shining in my eyes. Those kind of things will have to be replaced by sources that require even more mining. So if mining is an issue, we're going to have to address that. So if we're going to be honest about the problems that coal has and the problems that nuclear has, nuclear waste and radioactive waste and that sort of thing, we also need to be honest about the problems that are inevitably going to come from transitioning to a clean, renewable energy resource.
Thank you. John, let me give you the last word on this before we go to the last statement, and that is, Mr. Martis put it out there, if you're serious about addressing climate change, you've got to choose nuclear.
I guess what I'd say to that is that it seems, and you correct me, Kevin, I think there's probably a couple new nuclear plants that are kind of being built in the United States now. Just one?
Yeah, that's true.
Right, one or two. And a number have been scuttled over the years.
Also true.
Right. And of course, many are coming offline because they're old. So it seems to me that there's somewhere a political, social will not to build new nuclear plants. I'm just observing that. I don't necessarily have a particular opinion about that, but it certainly seems like if it is a football field of nuclear waste, nobody wants it necessarily in their backyard.
Sure, which is why James Hansen and Michael Schellenberger have proposed a similar Green New Deal, but a green new nuclear deal. And so our premise is that we're going to use the fiat power of government to compel a Green New Deal. We could also use that same power to compel nuclear construction. I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't get any compensation from any energy source, but there are certain facts. And if it's urgent, there's a reason James Hansen and Michael Schellenberger and Bill Gates are saying, if you take nuclear off the table, you're not really serious about making any progress in the limited time window that we have. All we've seen is incremental increases in reductions in emissions. And in fact, in Germany, during their Energiewende, they've shut nuclear down. And in fact, their emissions have stayed flat or even risen because they tried to replace nuclear power with wind and solar. There is no known way to replace nuclear power with wind and solar without emissions going up because you're going to fill in the gaps with a dispatchable coal or gas plant. That's just a reality. I wish it weren't. I wish I had a little suitcase like this that could power my entire life, and I wouldn't have to talk to DTE or consumers ever again, and I could just carry my little portable energy device with me. Until dilithium crystals are invented, I guess we're out of luck.
Thank you. That, in a way, anticipates the last question for which we have about 8 minutes, or last statement, sorry. And it's this. It is possible to find common ground between those who find elements of the Green New Deal appealing or even necessary, and those who, at least on the face of it, think it's misguided or even harmful. There is, agree or disagree, a both-and solution to the potentially devastating effects of unchecked climate change.
These questions confuse me.
Yeah.
It's a statement.
Can we
I
do
keep
both?
putting it in the form of a question. Somehow that seems fitting, doesn't it? There is, I guess, what this statement, could be read at both and. In other words, there does seem to be a strong wind-solar component coming from the left side. The right side ends, at least for the moment, ends on the side of nuclear. Is there a both and that you think you could find common ground on based on what you've heard each other say this evening?
Just one thing I would say perhaps is that, human beings, we're not good at predicting the future. We're not good at looking out. Some say it's because of our evolution that we were just kind of hominids and we were hunter-gatherers for a long time. We didn't have a lot of time to plan. We were trying not to be somebody else's dinner. And so I don't really know what's going to be out 10 years from now. I got to be honest with you. I really don't know. I don't know. And, and we're seeing these extreme weather events happening more and more. Is that climate change. Some of us believe it is. Some just suggest it's just cycle of weather. It would seem to me that there is something afoot and going on. And it would seem to me this notion of kind of mobilizing to modernize our electric and our gas and our energy systems, to put people to work, to look for solutions, to look at those trade-offs about what everything has a trade-off, right? Everything has a trade-off. Like, you might have to mine more here, you might have to do this over here. All these kinds of activities seem infinitely worthwhile to me, because I think what that does is it looks to ingenuity, it looks to finding solutions among us, it looks to common ground between us. I think what doesn't work is to look back and either blame the fossil fuel industry, which I don't think is fair, because we didn't necessarily know about some of the externalities of burning fossil fuels. But I also think we need to be thinking about those kinds of transitions that do a couple things. And one of them is, frankly, a little bit of having local control. Excuse me. In other words, some of your energy source is going to be held locally, community. You're going to have it. It's kind of like the old model, right? Grand Rapids used to have a hydroelectric plant. They gave it up, 1906 or thereabouts. So some of these solutions, I think, help to build community, help to build awareness, and help also to make people think more consciously about super bright lights and leaving the heat up to 72 while you're out for the Tuesday evening. So I think, I'm hopeful.
Please.
Okay?
Yeah.
You want me to go?
Sure,
Okay.
go ahead.
I have to say that I appreciate this discussion tonight, because I'm primarily a land use expert who has fallen into the energy policy analysis stuff as a byproduct of being in a township where utility scale wind and then utility scale solar was proposed. So when the state policies are created, maybe that's why I'm a little sensitive about this urban-rural divide, because I live on the rural side and I see what that means in our communities. And it's been destructive to our communities. I've seen this all across the Midwest. But the thing that has been so positive tonight is that we've had a discussion on the facts, and we can work towards the science and the economics. What has been left out of this discussion, which sadly doesn't take place most of the time, is these ad hominem attacks that the second you criticize wind or solar, you're somehow secretly funded by the Koch brothers. And I think it never reached a lower low than when Jeff Gibbs, who is Michael Moore's producer, published an op-ed in 2012 during the Proposal 3 debate, in which he referred to 25 by 25 as the big fat biomassacre, and it was published in Huffington Post. You didn't have to read more than 4 comments down until somebody was accusing Michael Moore's producer of secretly being funded by the Koch brothers. I mean, I think the irony is not lost on anybody in that statement. My point is, too often people begin to look for some secret motivation, and I think there is a chance for a dialogue as long as we stay on the high road, look at economics, look at science, look at data, and let's have a rational and dispassionate discussion about true and false, virtues and vices, and not politics.
I would, of course, agree with that. I'm happy that we're able to come together in these times and have an actual discourse about this with respect and with attention to the facts and with, an honest appreciation of our differences in views. I would, I think Michael mentioned I'm a philosopher, so here we go. I would say the data, the facts, the evidence, the arguments is the foundation of what we talk about. But whether it's in the context of the Green New Deal and concern about climate change, or in the context of any other change that any society is always going through, we have an opportunity as we look toward the future to say, how do we pull things together and address multiple problems at once? One of the strategies of opposing the Green New Deal has been, well, sure, let's just focus on environment and leave all these other things out of the discussion. And as a matter of fact, all these things are intricately interrelated, often in surprising and unexpected way. One simple example, the slogan, poverty is pollution, which goes back to Indira Gandhi in the 1970s. Poor people don't have the capability or the opportunity to make better choices for their environment, right? Or for their own health, or for, right? And that, I think, is the link in to the broader social ambitions of the Green New Deal. Whether we call it the Green New Deal or whatever, I don't care, but I think it's a catalyst for us as a collective society here, as a group of people who are all in the same lifeboat here going forward, folks, to think about what kind of world we want to create, not just in terms of the scientific data, but in terms of the bigger values and issues, and you know, providing opportunities and capabilities for all of us. I think that would be a good thing to get to common ground on.
Thank you. For the rest of you, would you be willing to make your closing arguments in the context of a Q&A?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, to be fair to the audience and begin to open things up. So, Jacob, how did you organize that?
We have question cards, so we'll have the staff members walk through and grab those, and then I'll bring those up to you, Michael, to sit through a few of those.
Great. Please raise your cards.
I just wanted to comment regarding whether we can come to an agreement. And one of the biggest issues with the Green New Deal, as it's written, and I'm hearing, you know, it's just a resolution, is that there doesn't seem to be agreement on what the problem is we're trying to solve. And when you read the Green New Deal, it reads like an academic experiment more than a realistic policy. So the advocates of Green New Deal seem to be trying to solve two problems, not one. First problem being the emission problem. They're trying to basically recreate an entirely new government that serves two purposes. One is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the second is to, as I mentioned earlier, correct any and all of the injustices, wage balance, other things. Everyone has a home, everyone has universal health care. That's a lot to be put into one policy, and if that's what we're going to debate on, I can assure you there's not going to be agreement. We need to understand first what the problem is that we're trying to solve, decide on that, and then maybe we can move forward, and then get to the data. Thank you.
I'm just sifting through just half so far. Some really great questions. Do you all have another hour and a half or so to do? I'll start with this one. So this is for the entire panel. During World War II, much was asked of U.S. citizens for the war effort. After 9/11, President Bush asked us only to, quote, keep shopping. What do you feel should be asked of Americans, given that we're facing this coming climate catastrophe?
Probably not keep shopping. That won't get us where we need to be.
John, you alluded to this earlier in some of your remarks, that solar on every roof, battery in the garage. Do you want to say more about that, or?
Well, I guess that kind of gets at sort of the notion of mindfulness, like to be thinking about your own behaviors, your own consumption, your own travel, what you eat, some of those kinds of things like that. It's interesting, some of these surveys I've looked at, people, well, even the IPCC in their climate report, their global warming report, suggested that it's not too late to do something about this. And a lot of surveys of Americans find, majority think there's time to address these issues. In other words, pessimism, fatalism hasn't kicked in yet. But I think Kevin pointed out we're already 2 years past the IPCC report, right? That said we had 12 years to kind of get our act together to reduce global warming. So I guess I sometimes wonder, Michael, at one point do we kick it into gear? When does people's awareness translate into some consequential actions? And I will say that, don't kid yourself that individuals don't matter. Our modest community solar park in East Lansing that I mentioned earlier, we have 150 participants. businesses, public institutions, churches, individuals. We're going to produce about 11 million clean kilowatt hours of power over the next 25 years, and we're going to sequester about 8 million pounds of coal equivalent, carbon equivalent with that project. That's 150 individuals, if you will, kind of making a difference. So you can make a difference as an individual.
Does everyone remember, people in this room remember the population bomb, future shock, Soylent Green in the 70s? Okay, one of the reasons why I personally have some difficulty with the Green New Deal and the concerns is because we've seen this movie before. 2 years from now, 2022, was when Soylent Green, we were all supposed to be burning up from heat, no homes, we had to share our homes with everyone else, no access to water, and we were eating people as our food supply. Okay, that was the story of Soylent Green. For those who haven't seen it, I recommend you do. I grew up on that. I was scared to death by that. I wouldn't take the bus because of that. Okay, so where are we going to be in 10 years? Honestly, technology solved a lot of our problems, and the future shock and population bomb didn't come to fruition, Soylent Green. So I'd like to know really what the problem is we're trying to solve. Thank you.
And I'll kind of build on that. The reality is that a lot of the things that we're working with right now are already having an impact. Like from 1970 to 2017, the United States has reduced the six criteria pollutants, the NOx, the SOx, the particulate matter, lead, ozone, all of those by 74% on average over that 40 to 50 year period. Last year, the International Energy Association published a paper just a few days ago that said last year the United States reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 2.9%, 140 million tons. So compare that to the entire European Union, which reduced its CO2 emissions by 160 million tons. So the United States, without the Paris Agreement, totally on our own, and using things like market-based fuel switching and that sort of thing, have really led the world in emissions reductions, greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So this notion that we need to impose a massive bureaucracy to make these changes happen is really inaccurate. We do not need to basically return ourselves to a 17th century lifestyle or a developing world lifestyle to be able to achieve these things. We're doing it now, currently, through market means primarily.
Well, perhaps this question follows up on that to some degree, and that is, this writer says, how about investing in smart technologies to a greater degree in manufacturing that we're many years behind the ball in terms of where others might be? So in other words, is there a technological fix in terms of smart technology that might help us get much farther ahead on this than we are now?
Yeah, I'll grab that because absolutely there is technology that's working. We've got things like Nest thermometers that are coming out to help people know how much electricity they're using or gas or whatever they're using to heat their homes. There are other technologies where literally you can, you basically put a coil around the electrical wires that are coming into your house, and it tells you, literally live tells you how much electricity you're using. So I have a good friend who, when we're at a conference, will sit there and go, my wife just turned on the microwave. Oh, now she's watching TV. He can keep track of what's happening literally by how much electricity is being used in his house. He knows down to the watt, really, what is going on in his house. And it's that kind of informed consumer, the prosumer, who can make those good decisions on their own. They don't need a mandate. They don't need the state government looking in and going, how many kilowatts did you use in the last hour? They don't need the state doing that because they can choose to do that themselves.
think John might want to weigh in. He's more the expert on things like the smart grid and so on. I want to put in a plug for smart technology geared toward efficiency, and it does not have to be quite as eerily stalkerish as what you were describing. You know, one of the most effective and available technologies to help meet you know, our goals here is like 8 inches of decent insulation in a house that doesn't have it, right? Improved energy efficient thermal windows, things like that, you know, replacing the roof. Upgrading the HVAC systems so that they're more efficient, upgrading the hot water systems across the board, which I would, again, point out is central to the Green New Deal as it was proposed as a vague resolution. So yes, technology can help a great deal here, and it doesn't even have to be enormously expensive or complicated.
If I might follow up on that, I also happen to be in one of my many lives a licensed remodeling contractor and home builder. So I see how these energy efficiency programs actually work out. I've done 2 replaces. So when we had the big polar vortex and it was 18 below in Linowes County, suddenly people are calling me to do new window replacements, right? And so we did several houses worth of windows, and a month or 2 after the window thing was done, they called and said, hey, by the way, Consumers Energy has this great energy efficiency rebate. Can I, you know, I need an invoice that shows what kind of windows we put in so I can comply with that. And I'm thinking, this is very interesting. Consumers is getting paid guaranteed profits on managing this energy efficiency program, first of all. So secondly, now they're going to come back to Lansing and take credit for replacing 2 houses full of windows, when in truth, they replaced the windows because they had a very high heating bill the previous year and only found out after the fact that they qualified for a rebate. So the bottom line is, when people have the means to do so, we already have ample financial incentive to adopt energy efficiency means. Every business does because it puts more money in their pocket. So I'm all about energy efficiency, and I've always built homes that are above the code requirement for energy efficiency because I just think it makes good sense for the consumer and it doesn't cost much up front. But you always want to watch out when somebody wants to jump at the head of the line and take credit for those things, particularly when a profit is attached to it.
Here is a question. Yes. Government subsidies have funded the fossil fuel industries for the past 100 plus years. Why are those who are against, at least to some degree, the Green New Deal, also against the government subsidy of renewable energy?
I'm totally opposed to subsidies of all types to all energy sources. Just get that off my chest.
Okay.
Can I comment on that?
Sure.
Okay, for a long time, we have heard that fossil fuel industry is subsidized by the federal government. In fact, it is not subsidized by the federal government. There is tax policy that people who do mining and extraction, oil and gas extraction, and other kinds of activities related to fossil fuel happen to be in the tax code, but they are not subsidies. They are tax credits that are available because a coal miner, any kind of mining, gets the same tax credits. That is not the same as what we're talking about with wind and solar, where in the case of wind, for every kilowatt hour of generation it produces, it gets a subsidy, unlimited. There is no other subsidy in any of the energy field equivalent to what the wind energy gets. No, it's not the same thing because it's not targeted for, it's not targeted towards energy development. That nuclear power plant does not get a subsidy for producing electricity. An oil and gas, a gas plant doesn't get a subsidy for producing electricity. Those subsidies are tied to mining and other kinds of activities that are extraction activities that have long been in place. It's not the same thing as getting paid for every kilowatt hour of generation you put out. And to be clear, the wind industry, right now, 50% of their capital costs, roughly, is in the form of a subsidy. There's nothing like that in the oil and gas or traditional sources of generation at all.
the tax credits for actual delivery of energy, which is not what coal, gas, and nuclear get. They're not getting a tax credit for the power produced. Any so-called subsidies or federal support or benefit for that is happening at the extraction stage. But there's a bigger fundamental question here. Wind currents and oil streams don't get tax credits. Utilities and power producers get those tax credits. And since the tax credit for wind and solar accrues in large part to fossil fuel utilities, wind tax credits are essentially just one more layer of subsidy or federal support for those already existing fossil fuel utilities. Jimmy Rogers, who was the CEO of Duke Energy, says, I'm not in this on some green crusade. I'm in it for the money. Warren Buffett says, who's very environmentally minded, he says, look, I'll do anything to shelter the taxable income of Berkshire Hathaway. That's why I build a lot of wind turbines, but they don't make any sense without the tax credit. So those tax credits are flowing primarily to fossil fuel utilities, not the air currents. That's why it's a distinction without a real difference.
And then also on that same idea, the Energy Information Administration published a report just, I think it was 2019, that said essentially the renewable energy industry received 45% of the subsidies, direct federal subsidies that were given out in 2016, and that was the most recent numbers they had. Compare that to coal received, I think it was 8%, and then natural gas actually paid more in than it received. So it received -5%. So and those are EIA numbers, not fossil fuel industry numbers. So natural gas actually paid more than it received.
No. To be clear, a power plant, like a wind power plant and a solar power plant, they're getting subsidies for every kilowatt hour of generation they put on the grid. They're getting paid. And you're paying that through your tax. But, okay, so solar is the ITC, correct. But a natural gas plant gets no subsidies. A oil plant, a coal plant gets no subsidies.
I'm going to refer this one to your study, and I'm not sure that it's going to be much more productive than it's. Maybe the last question, and I'm sorry, there are many, many good questions, but we are looking at time constraints now. Are billionaire philanthropists the best solution? The reason I write this one is because, articulate this one is because Jeff Bezos, of course, was in the news, was it yesterday or today, committing $10 billion, 7.5% of his net worth to environmental causes, specifically fighting climate change of one kind or another, in the kind of culture we have, even right here in West Michigan, in which philanthropy plays such a big part in quote-unquote quality of life. This perhaps is a serious question. Should we look to well-meaning, well-intended billionaires to save us?
Yes, and my first name is spelled Kevon, if you're going to put it on the check.
So you're going to pick on the nonprofit guy, aren't you? Again, there's money looking for a home in all of this. Bezos' $10 billion, I think, is the largest grant ever made. I think he just articulated that yesterday, I believe. He recognizes, that Amazon has a contribution to climate change, and he's doing something about it. I think it's 7% of his wealth, which is just staggering to me, but nonetheless. A lot of foundations, by the way, are looking at other vehicles to invest in clean energy, something called PRI, Program-Related Investment, in which it's not actually a donation or a grant, but rather it's kind of investment. And so you as a nonprofit or whatever you are need to be able to kind of show economic activity and a margin and then pay that loan off. It tends to be patient, long-term capital, but that's another way to move the market. And we were talking about big oil and big gas, and my understanding is that the extraction industry gets about $25 billion a year in some kind of subsidy, call it what you want to call it. But big oil and big gas is moving into renewables big time. So BP, Chevron, Shell, These guys are owning solar companies, Lightsource, Silicon Ranch. They own all kinds of wind farms. And why are they doing this? Well, probably for a bunch of reasons, but I imagine at a certain point, they see a profit in it, and that's why they're doing that as well. So I think yes to all the above in terms of funding this stuff. I don't think it's necessarily at all going to be a government handout. I think instead it's going to be private capital, finding a way to bankroll those projects, those programs, that technology, that approach that makes the most sense and ideally has the most multipliers and benefits for everyone.
Comment real quick. According to the U.S. Treasury, in the next 10 years, between now and 2028, $60 billion plus is going to be paid in the form of subsidies to the wind and solar industries. As by 2023, we're actually going to pay out, that's collectively over a 10-year period, we're going to pay like $9 billion. That's not, the closest fossil fuel subsidy is coming in at a fraction of that, under $10 billion, way under. And so we're not, there's very little, any form of tax credit that's going to extraction purposes. But, so I just want to make clear that we're paying above and beyond anything we've seen for right now for solar and wind.
Yeah, the federal support for gas and coal-fired generation, it baked into the cost of unit of energy delivered is about 65 cents per megawatt hour. The federal support for wind is about $23 per megawatt hour. So you see, if you take all the federal support in any form away from coal-fired generation, the price of your coal-fired electricity is going to jump from $30 a megawatt hour to $30.65. It's relatively trivial. Now, in mass, because the bulk of our economy is based on fossil fuel generation, of course, over a long term, they have a much larger number. But per unit of energy delivered, wind and solar are way at the top. And you have to remember, wind and solar are among the most expensive ways to reduce CO2 emissions at a price of 4 to 5 times the social cost of carbon. That's a serious question that needs to be addressed.
We have about 1 minute left.
Thought I had a way to
Somehow
sign
a
this
moment of
off.
silence is called for.
Let's just give one more round of applause for our panelists and our moderator, Michael DeWilde, tonight. On behalf of everyone at the Hauenstein Center and our partner in the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative, thank you all for joining us tonight for the 9th installment in our Progressive Conservative Summit.